I want to make one thing clear before I tell you what happened. There was nothing strange about that night. No bad feeling, no sense of dread. If you're expecting me to say I felt watched or uneasy beforehand, you'll be disappointed. That's not how it started. That's not how real fear usually starts. It begins when everything feels normal enough that you don't question it. It was a Tuesday night in late October of 1992. I remember the month because the leaves were already mostly gone, and the nights had that cold dampness that settles into your bones without warning. I was 47 years old at the time, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The kind of place where people waved, mowed their lawns on Saturdays, and locked their doors more out of habit than concern. My wife was out of town visiting her sister. The kids were grown and gone. The house was empty except for me and the steady ticking of the wall clock in the living room. I had the television on low, mostly for background noise. The late news was wrapping up weather, then sports and rain was moving across several states, slow and steady. I remember thinking it sounded peaceful. I was sitting in my recliner, brown fabric, slightly worn on the arms, with my feet up and a cup of coffee on the side table. Yes, coffee. I've always done that, even late at night. Old habits don't die easily. The room was dim, lit mostly by the lamp behind me. The blinds were closed. The front and back doors were locked, at least as far as I knew. There was nothing unusual about the house itself. It wasn't old. No creaking floors or shadowy hallways. Just a standard split level built in the late 70s. Beige siding, white trim, predictable in every way. If you had driven past it that night, you wouldn't have given it a second glance. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the phone rang. Not a cell phone. Those didn't exist in any meaningful way back then. This was the landline, beige, mounted on the wall between the living room and kitchen. The ring cut sharply through the quiet, loud enough to make me flinch. I remember being irritated more than anything else. Anyone calling that late usually meant trouble, and I wasn't in the mood for it. I stood up, crossed the room, and picked up the receiver. I said, "Hello." There was a pause on the other end. No static, no breathing. Just silence, deliberate, controlled. The kind that tells you someone is there but deciding when to speak. I was seconds away from hanging up when a man's voice finally came. Through, calm, steady, middle-aged, no accent I could place. He said my first name. Not sir, not hello, my name. That alone tightened something in my chest. I asked who it was. He didn't answer. Instead, he said something that sounded almost casual. "You left the kitchen light on." Without thinking, I turned my head and looked toward the kitchen. The light was on. That didn't mean much by itself, except the blinds were closed. The light couldn't be seen from outside, and I hadn't told anyone I was home alone that night. I let out a short laugh, trying to keep things light. I told myself it was probably a wrong number, or some kind of stupid joke. I asked again who was calling. He replied, "You're sitting in the brown recliner, and your coffee's gone cold." That's when my smile disappeared, because he was right. And before I could say anything else, he added quietly, almost thoughtfully, "You should lock the back door." Asterisk. I didn't move right away after he said that. I stood there holding the phone, staring toward the kitchen doorway like it might explain something if I looked hard enough. The man hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened me. That somehow made it worse. Fear doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it speaks calmly, like it already knows how things are going to go. I asked him how he knew that. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Years of working around people teaches you how to keep your tone even when your thoughts are racing. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked one of his own. Did you check the lock before you sat down? That was the moment my brain finally accepted that this wasn't a joke. Not a wrong number. Not a neighbor messing around. Nobody casually asks a question like that unless they already know the answer or want you to realize you don't. I told him I wasn't interested in playing games and that I was hanging up. That was a lie. I didn't hang up. I couldn't. Something about the situation had its hooks in me. I wanted information. I needed it. He let out a slow breath, like someone disappointed but not surprised. I didn't say it to scare you, he said. I said it because it's still unlocked. That sent a cold ripple through my chest. I turned and walked toward the back of the house, phone pressed tight to my ear, every step suddenly loud in the quiet rooms. The hallway felt longer than usual, narrower. I could hear my own breathing now, shallow and quick. I reached the back door and stared at it for a second before touching the handle. I honestly expected it to be locked, expected the man to be wrong, so I could tell myself I'd imagined the rest. I hadn't locked it. The handle turned easily under my hand. I locked it immediately, sliding the bolt into place with a loud, final click. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't know why, but something told me not to. I stood there in the dark kitchen, rain tapping against the window above the sink. The phone still pressed to my ear. How did you know that? I asked again. He paused. Then he said, because you've always forgotten that one. That word always bothered me more than anything else he'd said so far. It implied familiarity, routine, like he wasn't talking about this one night, but many nights. I asked him who he was watching me for. I demanded to know what he wanted. I'm not watching you for anyone, he replied. I'm just watching. My mouth went dry. I asked him where he was calling from. In your house, he said. I felt a rush of heat, then a wave of cold that made my knees weak. I spun around, scanning the kitchen, the doorway, the shadows beyond. The house was still, quiet. The only sound was the rain and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I told him to stop. I told him I was calling the police. You can, he said, but you won't, not yet. I asked him why, because you're still trying to figure out if I'm telling the truth. He wasn't wrong. I hated that he wasn't wrong. He started describing things then, small things. The framed photo on the hallway wall that hung slightly crooked. The loose step on the stairs that creaked if you stepped on the left side. The way the porch light flickered sometimes before staying on. None of these things were impossible to guess, but together they formed a picture that felt too complete, too personal. You moved that picture last spring, he said. After you repainted. I hadn't told anyone about that. Not even my wife remembered. My grip on the phone tightened until my hand hurt. I realized I hadn't checked the rest of the house. The basement. The garage. I hadn't checked anything except the back door. I asked him again where he was. This time. His answer was quieter. Close enough that if you turn around too fast, he said, you'll scare yourself. And then the line went dead. Asterisk, I stood there for a full minute after the line went dead. The receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. Not even a dial tone at first, Just that hollow silence you get when a call ends too abruptly. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I kept telling myself the same thing over and over. This is a prank. It has to be. But the words didn't carry any weight anymore. They were just noise. I slowly lowered the phone and hung it back on the wall. The kitchen felt different now. Smaller, like the walls had shifted closer together while I wasn't looking. I turned on the overhead light despite telling myself I wouldn't. The sudden brightness made everything look flat and exposed. And somehow that was worse than the dark. The first thing I did was grab the knife from the block on the counter. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not going to pretend I was thinking clearly either. It wasn't about planning anything. It was about holding something solid, something real, while my mind raced ahead of itself. I checked the back door again. Locked. I tested it twice. Then I moved through the kitchen, peering into corners like I expected someone to be crouched there. Nothing. The pantry was empty. The laundry room was empty. The silence pressed in around me, thick and heavy. I went room by room after that. Living room, dining room, bathroom. Each light came on with a soft click that sounded far too loud. I opened closets. I checked behind the shower curtain, even though I knew how ridiculous that looked. Every space was empty, exactly as it should be. Asterisk, when I reached the front door, I hesitated. Part of me was afraid to unlock it, even just to check the handle. I finally did, heart hammering, and found it locked tight. Deadbolts secure. No signs of tampering. No scratches. No damage. The upstairs took longer. The house always felt different at night, but now every creak of the stairs sounded like a deliberate signal. I checked the bedrooms, the bathroom, the hall closet. I even opened the attic access panel, half expecting something to move in the darkness above. Nothing did by the time I finished. I had proven one thing. There was no one in the house. That should have made me feel better. It didn't, because if the man wasn't inside, that meant he knew all those things without being there, or he had been there earlier. Both possibilities were worse than the first. I went back downstairs and sat on the couch instead of the recliner. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to sit where he said I'd been sitting. The coffee was still on the side table, untouched. I didn't drink it. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said it was cold, like he'd been watching the steam fade. I picked up the phone and dialed my wife's sister's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I hung up without leaving a message. I didn't want to sound panicked. I didn't want to explain. I told myself I'd call back later once I'd calmed down. I sat there listening to the rain and the clock on the wall, every second ticking by louder than the last. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I kept expecting the phone to ring again, and when it didn't, the waiting became its own kind of torture. At 11:26 p.m., the phone rang. I jumped so hard, the knife slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. I stared at the phone like it might bite me. It rang again, then again. I didn't answer. On the 4th ring, it stopped. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body tense, ears straining for any sound beyond the rain. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone on the other end had decided something. Then the answering machine clicked on. I'd forgotten it was even there. The red light blinked as the tape began to record, and through the speaker came the man's voice, softer now, almost patient. "I know you're there," he said. "You always wait like this." I lunged for the answering machine and slammed the stop button so hard my finger hurt. The tape whined as it cut off mid-sentence, leaving the room unnaturally quiet again. My hands were shaking now, badly enough that I had to set the machine down carefully so I wouldn't drop it. I realized I was sweating, even though the house felt cold. You always wait like this. That sentence wouldn't leave my head. Not you're waiting. Not you waited. Always. Like this wasn't the first time he'd seen me hesitate. Like he was commenting on a habit. I picked up the phone and checked for a dial tone. It was there, normal, steady. That somehow made everything feel more unreal. I dialed *69, the last call return service. I'd used it once before out of curiosity, never thinking it would matter. A recorded voice told me the number was unavailable. I tried again. Same result. I sat back down on the couch and forced myself to think logically. Someone knew details about my house. That meant one of three things. They had been inside before. They lived close enough to observe patterns over time. Or they had access to information they shouldn't. None of those options led anywhere comforting. But at least they were grounded in reality. I told myself to call the police. I even picked up the phone to do it, but my hand froze over the keypad. What exactly was I going to say? A man called and knew things about my house. No threats. No break-in. No evidence. I'd sound paranoid and worse. I knew it. That hesitation disgusted me even as I felt it. Fear has a way of making you doubt your own instincts. I got up and walked through the house again, slower this time, paying attention to details. The windows were locked. The screens were intact. No muddy footprints. No disturbed objects. Everything was exactly where it should be, except me. I checked the garage last. The door from the kitchen was locked, but I unlocked it and stepped inside anyway, flipping on the overhead light. The concrete floor was bare. No cars, my wife had taken hers, and mine was parked on the street because I'd been cleaning out the garage earlier that day. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint, but it didn't belong there. Not gas, not oil. Something older, stale, like fabric that had been stored too long in a damp place. I stood still and took a slow breath, trying to place it. The smell didn't get stronger anywhere in particular. It was just present. I told myself I was imagining it. I went back inside, locked the garage door, and leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed. That was when I realized something else. The answering machine light was still blinking. I hadn't erased the message. I'd only stopped it. The tape was still there. I sat back down and stared at the machine for a long time before pressing play. Part of me didn't want to hear the rest. Another part needed to dot the tape, clicked, rewound slightly. And his voice came back on. "I know you're there," he repeated. "You always wait like this. Sitting where you can see the phone but not the doors." I felt a sharp twist in my chest. I hadn't even been aware I was doing that, positioning myself to watch the phone, not the house. He continued, "You've done that since the kids were small. Back when you worried more." I had to stop the tape again. The kids. I hadn't mentioned them. I hadn't even thought about them that night until that moment. The room felt suddenly too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I looked toward the hallway that led to their old bedrooms. Empty now, but still full of memories I hadn't touched in years. I tried to tell myself this was coincidence, guesswork, psychological manipulation. But the details were stacking up, and they weren't vague. They were specific in a way that felt invasive, like someone going through your drawers instead of your trash. The phone rang again. This time, I answered it without thinking. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said something I still can't explain. "I just wanted to see if you remembered me." I asked him what he meant by that. My voice didn't sound like my own anymore. Flatter, quieter, like I was afraid the house itself was listening. I kept my eyes on the hallway as I spoke, even though I knew there was nothing there. Old instincts don't disappear. They just wait. "You don't," he said after a moment. "That's all right. Most people don't remember the things that mattered to someone else." I told him again to tell me who he was. I needed a name, a face, anything solid to attach this to. Without it, the fear had nowhere to land. It just spread. He chuckled softly, not mocking, almost understanding. "I was in your house once," he said. "Years ago. You let me in. That didn't make sense." I told him he was wrong. I didn't let strangers into my home. I never had. He didn't argue with me. He never argued. He just waited for me to catch up. "It was summer," he continued. "Hot enough that the doors stayed open. You were younger, tired, still trying to do everything right." My mind started searching then, rifling through memories I hadn't touched in decades. Summers blurred together, kids running in and out, neighbors stopping by, friends of friends I barely remembered. The certainty I'd felt a minute earlier began to crack. He said my daughter's name next. I won't repeat it here. Hearing it out loud again still makes my stomach tighten. It wasn't just that he knew it. It was the way he said it. Familiar, careful, like he was handling something fragile. "You were distracted," he said. She dropped her bike. "You went to check the scrape." That's when I came inside. My mouth went dry. That memory surfaced whether I wanted it to or not. A flash of sun. The sound of a bike hitting pavement. My daughter crying more from surprise than pain. I had gone inside to get bandages. I remembered that. I didn't remember anyone else being there. "That's not possible," I said. I needed it not to be possible. I would remember. "You remember what mattered to you," he replied. "Not what mattered to me." I felt sick then. Not scared, sick. A deep, sinking realization that something had slipped past me long ago without my noticing. He wasn't talking about breaking in. He was talking about being overlooked. "You sat me at the kitchen table," he said. "Gave me water. You told me to wait while you finished up." I stared at the kitchen doorway again, the lights still on. I had done that countless times. Neighbors, kids, delivery men, strangers who didn't feel like threats because I was busy, because it was daylight, because nothing bad was supposed to happen. "I waited," he said. "You forgot." The words hit harder than any threat could have. Not forgotten as in later. Forgotten as in forever. I asked him what he wanted now. I asked him why he was calling me after all this time. "I don't want anything," he said. "I just wondered if you ever thought about that day." I told him I didn't. I told him if something had happened, I would have known. I would have noticed. "That's what I used to think," he replied. "About you." There was something in his tone then, not anger, not accusation, disappointment, like I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. "You moved," he said. "Changed routines, locked doors more carefully. But you never fixed the part where you stopped seeing people once you decide they're harmless. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing through every half-remembered face from those years. Every stranger I'd trusted because it was easier than being cautious. You did better with the kids, he said. I'll give you that. That's when I felt real fear again. Sharp. Immediate. Why are you talking about my kids? I demanded. There was a long pause. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, very quietly, because they were the reason I left. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because every possible response felt wrong. My throat tightened, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I forced myself to inhale slowly, carefully, like I was afraid the sound might provoke him. What do you mean by that? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed. Not louder, not harsher, just more deliberate. Like someone choosing each word with care. I mean, he said, that I understood something about you that day. Something you didn't understand about yourself yet. I told him to explain. I needed clarity, even if I didn't like where it led. Silence stretched between us again, long enough that I checked the phone cord to make sure it was still connected. You were tired, he said finally. Overworked. Trying to be patient when you didn't feel patient. You wanted quiet, order. You wanted things to make sense. I didn't deny that. Most parents feel that way at some point. That didn't make what he was saying acceptable, but it made it uncomfortably relatable. They were loud, he continued. Messy, everywhere. You loved them, but you were overwhelmed. My jaw tightened. I told him to stop. I told him he didn't know what he was talking about. I knew enough, he replied. Enough to know you'd never forgive yourself if something happened to them. Enough to know that fear would change you. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. Is that a threat? I asked. No, he said calmly. It's an observation. I stood up and began pacing the living room, phone pressed to my ear, my free hand clenched into a fist. My thoughts were spiraling now, racing ahead to places I didn't want to go. I kept picturing my kids as they'd been back then, small, loud, careless in the way only children can be. You didn't do anything, I said, more to convince myself than him. If you had, I'd know. He sighed, slow and controlled. I didn't hurt them, he said. I didn't want to. That was somehow worse than a denial. It implied choice, deliberation. I sat there, he continued, and I watched you move through the house. Fixing problems, making things right. And I realized something. I stopped pacing. What? That you never once looked at me, he said. Not really. The room felt suddenly colder. I tried to picture that day, the kitchen table, the light, the heat, but my memory refused to cooperate. There was a blank space where a person should have been. You saw a situation, he said, not a person. And once the situation was resolved, I disappeared. My stomach turned. I asked him why he was telling me this now. Because people like you believe the danger passes once the moment passes, he said. You believe the story ends when the door closes. I asked him where he was. Still nearby, he said. Not close, just present. I felt anger flare up then, cutting through the fear. I told him he needed to leave me alone. That if he contacted me again, I would go to the police and keep going until someone listened. You could, he said, and maybe you should, but it won't change what already happened. I asked him what he wanted from me now. An apology, money, something. He laughed softly. I wanted to know, he said, if you'd recognize the feeling. What feeling? The one you have right now, he replied. The realization that safety is mostly just something we agree to believe in. I closed my eyes. My hand was cramping around the phone. You're not welcome in my life, I said. Not now. Not ever. There was another pause. Then he spoke again, quieter than before. I know, he said. That's why I didn't come back until they were grown. The implication hit me hard and fast. You watched us, I said. Yes, he replied. From a distance, I felt something inside me fracture, not panic. Not rage, but a deep, hollow understanding that whatever this was, it wasn't over yet. Good night, he said gently. The line went dead. Asterisk, I didn't hang up the phone right away. I just stood there, listening to the dead line hum faintly in my ear, like it was still holding on to his voice. When I finally set the receiver back in its cradle, the click sounded final in a way that made my stomach twist. The house felt altered, not invaded, not damaged, just claimed in some subtle way I couldn't explain. I checked the locks again. Every one of them. Front door, back door, garage, windows. I even locked the bedroom doors upstairs, something I hadn't done since the kids were small. The routine gave me something to focus on, but it didn't bring relief. It felt like rehearsing for something that was still coming. I turned off the television. The noise had become unbearable. Without it, the house settled into a deeper quiet, the kind where you start noticing sounds you normally ignore. Pipes cooling, wood shifting, the rain slowing to an irregular tapping against the windows. I sat back down on the couch and waited. That's the part I hate admitting. I didn't call the police. I didn't pack a bag and leave. I waited. Part of me still believed that if I stayed still, stayed alert, I could contain the situation. That belief was wrong, but it felt necessary at the time. At 12:14 a.m., the porch light turned on. I hadn't touched the switch. The light spilled across the front yard, illuminating wet grass and the empty sidewalk beyond. I stood slowly, heart pounding, and moved toward the front window. I didn't open the blinds. I just leaned close enough to see through the narrow gap between the slats. No one was there. The street was empty. No cars, no movement. Just the steady glow of the light and the rain-slicked pavement reflecting it back. I stepped away from the window and checked the switch. It was in the on position. I told myself it could have been a power fluctuation. Old wiring. Anything but intent. The phone rang again. I answered immediately, this time, anger overriding fear. You don't get to do this, I said. You don't get to decide when you come back into my life. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was softer than before. Tired, almost. I didn't turn the light on to scare you, he said. I turned it on so you wouldn't trip. I laughed then, a sharp, humorless sound that surprised even me. Trip over what? I demanded. The step you fixed last winter, he replied. You never quite leveled it. My legs felt weak. I sat down hard on the edge of the couch. You're outside, I said. Yes, he answered. I asked him where. He didn't give an address. He didn't need to. Across the street, he said. In the shadow of the maple tree. The one you keep meaning to trim. I didn't look again. I couldn't. I was suddenly aware of how exposed the house felt with the light on, like a stage set after the actors have left. "What do you want?" I asked. "I wanted to see if you'd come to the door," he said. "You always used to." I told him to leave. I told him I was calling the police right now. "You should," he said. "But you won't open the door first. You've learned that much." There was no satisfaction in his voice, just certainty. I asked him how long he planned to stay. "I'm already leaving," he said. "I just needed you to know that the distance you felt all these years wasn't protection. It was permission." Before I could respond, there was a soft sound through the phone, not a voice, but movement. Footsteps on wet pavement, then nothing. The line went dead. I sat there in the glow of the porch light until dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. When the sun finally came up, the street looked exactly as it always had, ordinary, harmless, familiar, but I knew something had changed. Because even now, decades later, when a light turns on and I don't remember flipping the switch, I don't check the wiring, I check the window. Asterisk, the police arrived at 6:42 that morning. I know the time because I checked the clock twice while waiting for the cruiser to pull up, half expecting it not to show at all. By then the porch light was off, the rain had stopped, and the neighborhood had returned to its usual early morning routine. Joggers, dog walkers, engines starting. Normal life resuming without my permission. I told the officer everything, or at least I thought I did. The calls, the details, the man across the street. As the words left my mouth, I could hear how thin they sounded. There were no threats, no witnesses, just a voice and my certainty that it mattered. The officer listened politely, took notes, asked reasonable questions, did a walk around of the house, checked the locks I'd checked a dozen times already. He didn't dismiss me outright, but I could tell where this was landing. Asterisk, you've had a stressful night, he said carefully. Sometimes people remember things differently under pressure. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. He suggested I get some rest, maybe stay with a friend for a day or two. He gave me a card and told me to call if anything else happened. Anything else, after he left. I walked through the house again, not to check for intruders, but to reassure myself that it was still mine. The kitchen looked unchanged. The hallway photos hung where they always had. The living room felt empty in a way it never had before, like furniture left behind after someone moves out. Asterisk, when my wife came home 2 days later, I told her a simplified version. Strange phone calls. Someone who knew too much. I left out the rest. The past. The watching. The kids. Not because I was protecting her, because I couldn't make it sound real without sounding unhinged. Asterisk, she believed me enough to be concerned. Not enough to be afraid. Life resumed. That's the part people don't talk about. Even after something like that, bills still need paying. Lawns still need mowing. Birthdays still arrive on schedule. The world doesn't pause to let you process what almost happened. Weeks passed, then months. The calls stopped completely. No breathing, no silence, no voice. If that had been the end of it, I might have convinced myself it was all stress, imagination, coincidence stacked too neatly. But other things began to happen instead. Small things, subtle things. The porch light would be on in the morning, even though I was certain I'd turned it off. The garage door would be open a few inches when I knew I'd closed it. Once, I found the kitchen chair pulled out from the table, angled slightly, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. I started keeping track, writing things down, dates, times, explanations I told myself, and then crossed out. Faulty switches, wind, forgetfulness, all plausible, all unsatisfying. I installed motion lights, then cameras. This was the late 90s by then, bulky, grainy, more comforting than effective. They never showed anything useful. No intruder, no movement, just hours of empty footage that somehow felt accusatory, like it was daring me to admit the truth. The worst part wasn't fear, it was erosion. I stopped sitting in the recliner, stopped leaving doors unlocked even during the day. I memorized patterns on the street, who left when, who came home late. I began noticing how easy it was to know these things without being noticed yourself. That realization sickened me. Years later, my daughter mentioned something casually during a visit. A memory from when she was young. A man in the kitchen she didn't recognize. Someone who smiled at her and told her to be careful with her bike. She couldn't remember his face. I told her it was probably a neighbor. That night, I didn't sleep because the most terrifying part wasn't that someone had watched my family. It was that they'd been close enough to be remembered and still overlooked. Asterisk, after my daughter said that, I started doing something I hadn't done in years. I went through old boxes, not the organized ones labeled with holidays or taxes, but the forgotten kind shoved into closets and corners. Things you keep not because they matter, but because throwing them away feels like erasing something you might need later. I was looking for proof, or disproof. I didn't know which I wanted more. Photographs came first. Birthday parties, backyard barbecues, school plays. I studied every background like a detective, scanning faces at the edges of frames. Neighbors I recognized, friends I remembered, and strangers I couldn't place. That alone meant nothing. Life is full of half-known faces, but one photo stopped me cold. It was from a summer picnic. The kids were young. My wife was laughing at something off camera, and behind the table, near the sliding door, stood a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me. The photo wasn't clear enough to see details, just a general build, short hair, plain clothes. He could have been anyone. That's what scared me. There was nothing remarkable about him at all. I showed the photo to my wife. She didn't remember him either. She assumed he was a friend of a friend, someone's cousin, a neighbor who stopped by. That's what I thought too, I said. She didn't catch the tone. She couldn't. I found more after that. Not many, just enough. A reflection in a window. A figure near the fence line. Always present. Never central. Always slightly out of focus. It became clear that whoever he was, he had mastered the art of being forgettable. That's when the phone book came out. Old phone books are strange artifacts. Entire lives reduced to names and numbers. I started with our street, then nearby blocks. I looked for patterns, names that appeared, disappeared, reappeared. People who moved often. People who lived alone. It was pointless. I knew that. But it gave me something to do with the dread. One name kept resurfacing. I won't say it here. Not because I'm protecting him, but because saying it doesn't add anything. The name itself was ordinary. That was the point. It belonged to someone who moved every few years, always within the same county, always close enough to be familiar, never close enough to stand out. I cross-referenced addresses with memories. A house near the school, an apartment by the grocery store, a rental down the street when the kids were in middle school. Always nearby, I checked public records next. Nothing criminal, no arrests, no charges, no flags. A clean life leaves very little trace. I told myself this still didn't prove anything. Correlation isn't causation. Coincidence happens. Memory fills gaps with shapes it recognizes. But then the phone rang. This time, it was during the day. I stared at it for a long time before answering. Some habits never leave you. Yes, I said. I wondered how long it would take, he replied. My hand tightened around the receiver. How long for what? For you to start looking backward instead of outward, he said. Most people never do. I asked him why he was calling again. I told him I wanted it to stop. I know, he said. That's why I waited. I asked him if he was the man in the photographs. I was in some of them, he admitted. Not all. The casual certainty in his voice made my skin crawl. Why me? I asked, why my family? There was a pause. Longer than usual. Because you're the kind of person people trust without realizing they've done it, he said. And you never notice the people who trust you back. I didn't understand. You gave me water, he continued. You gave me a chair. You gave me silence. That was enough. My chest felt tight. What do you want now? I wanted to see if you'd finally understand, he said, and to tell you something before I'm gone for good. I braced myself. You weren't special, he said. You were just convenient. The line went dead. Asterisk, after that last call, I stopped trying to catch him. That was the real shift. Not fear, not anger, acceptance. I finally understood something that should have been obvious much earlier. This wasn't a man who wanted attention, or revenge, or control in the way people usually mean it. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to be remembered, and only just enough to prove he had existed in my life without my consent. I disconnected the landline a week later. That wasn't dramatic, just practical. By then, cell phones were common enough. Friends thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I was. But the silence that followed felt different, final. I never heard his voice again. What didn't stop were the realizations. They came slowly, over years, in ordinary moments. Standing in line at a store, sitting in a waiting room, watching a stranger linger just a second too long near someone else's conversation. I began to recognize the behavior, not criminal, not threatening, just adjacent. Close enough to absorb details, far enough to avoid notice. I saw how easy it was. That knowledge ruined a certain kind of comfort forever. The kind that comes from assuming boundaries are automatic instead of enforced. I became less generous with access, less casual with trust. Not cold, just deliberate. I talked to my kids eventually, carefully, not about him specifically, but about presence, awareness, how kindness doesn't require proximity, how politeness doesn't require permission. They listened. I don't know how much they understood, but that wasn't the point. Years later, I sold the house. On the last day, after the movers left and the rooms echoed, I walked through one final time. Same beige walls, same kitchen light, same hallway photos, minus the ones I'd taken down long ago. The place felt empty in the normal way, not the haunted way people talk about. No sense of watching, no tension. At the front door, I hesitated. Then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I turned off the porch light in the middle of the day. Nothing happened, no call, no sound, no realization waiting for me. And for the first time since that night in 1992, I understood that the story wasn't about him anymore. It was about what I'd learned. Asterisk. I'm telling this now because time doesn't make these things less true. It just makes them quieter. People like to believe danger announces itself, that it looks wrong, sounds wrong, feels wrong from the start. That belief is comforting. It's also false. Nothing about him ever looked dangerous. He wasn't violent. He wasn't loud. He didn't force his way in or leave marks behind. He used what people willingly offered: distraction, courtesy, assumptions. The things we give away without noticing because we believe normal life is protection enough. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it could happen to you, you're asking the wrong question. The better one is whether it already has, in small, forgettable ways you dismissed because nothing bad followed, because the door eventually closed, because the moment passed. Most stories end when the threat is gone. This one ended when I finally understood that safety isn't the absence of harm, it's the presence of attention. I still think about him sometimes. Not with fear, with clarity. I don't imagine him watching me now. I don't check windows when lights turn on. I don't jump at phones ringing late at night. What I do notice are people standing slightly too close. Conversations that give away more than intended. The ease with which we invite strangers into our routines without realizing we've done it. That awareness cost me peace for a long time, but it also gave me something better. Control. And if there's anything I hope you take from this, especially if you've lived long enough to remember unlocked doors and trusting by default, it's this: most horror doesn't come from what breaks in. It comes from what's quietly allowed to stay. And the scariest part is realizing you were never powerless, just unprepared to pay attention. Asterisk.